Okay. The other thing I really like about good poetry, good writing, um, and you know, yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like these poets know that people are going to be studying them. It's hilarious because they basically say a lot of times they'll repeat the sort of same stuff, the same comment, but they just use different language. Um, so, for example, "'Tis with our judgments as our watches, none go just alike. Yet each believes his own," right? So each believes, even though we're different, each believes that his judgment is correct as a writer, as a critic, right? These last two lines of the stanza, basically they mean the same thing. Authors are partial to their wit, 'tis true, but are not critics to their judgment too. Now I'm arguing, my thesis is uh, that the critic, he's talking more smack about the critic than the author, right? So which two lines, even though they mean pretty much the same thing, which two lines defend that thesis the best? It's these last two lines. Archers are proper to their wit, 'tis true, but are not critics to their judgment too. So I'm sort of picking the one that I think is the strongest. And what's cool is that even if I didn't understand what these two lines meant, Alexander Pope gives me more ammo a little later by basically saying the same thing, just in a different way, and now he does it in a way that defends my thesis. So that's the one we're gonna pick. And most have seized judgment in their mind. Um, and then there's one more. Oh yeah, these born to judge as well as those to write. This is fine. Yeah, was both. We don't need that second line because we know we're talking about those who judge and those who write. The whole poem is about those who judge and those who write, essentially. And then he has a lot of allusions in here. I mean, but the crux of the poem is the sort of the comparison between the critic and the author. That's why it's called an essay on criticism. Um, so yeah, both. We'll just talk about in the essay. We'll talk about both, meaning both the author and the critic. So we don't. So you want to also, when you're picking your quotes, you want to be very specific and sort of think about these things. Like say, okay, am I being redundant here? Am I pulling, a 5-line quote? If you can pull out a 2-word quote that paints the same picture as a 5-line quote. I know you guys might not agree with me because you might want to, pad your paper, but I would pick the 2-line quote or the 2-word quote. You know, you want your analysis to be the meatiest. Because you're invariably you're gonna find quotes that are long. You're gonna find a 4-line quote, just like in our first stanza. We pretty much picked the whole first stanza. But so you also have a lot of stuff that's just really short. So nature affords at least a glimmering light. The lines, though touched but faintly, are drawn right. But as the slightest sketch, if justly traced, talking about drawing, and is by ill coloring, but the more disgraced. So by false learning is good sense defaced. I sort of know what it means. He's using an analogy, obviously, on coloring and drawing, and some are bewildered in the maze of schools, and some make coxcomb nature men but fools. In search of wit, these lose their common sense, and then turn critics in their own defense. Each burns alike who can or cannot write. So in search of wit, these lose their common sense, and then turn critics in their own defense. Each burns alike who can or cannot write. So in search of wit, these lose their common sense. So he's talking about the critic here. and then turn critics in their own defense. Each burns alike. So each critic burns, like talks smack alike, burns everyone. Just talk smack about everyone, no matter what. If they can write or they can't write. Or with a rival's or a eunuch's spite. So a eunuch is a boy that doesn't have his genitalia anymore. It's been cut off. And or so I remember. And remember, I'm years out of school, so I'm probably gonna say some things that perhaps I'm not right on about. But if I can, bring a level of, some quality writing, then like you guys being in school, hopefully you're in school or you're taking these classes. Hopefully like you can not knock it out because I'm yeah. So I'll obviously look up eunuch and all that stuff, but I pretty clearly recall that. So with the rivals or eunuch's spite. So eunuch is going to spite whoever cut his genitalia off. So the critic is going to talk smack. And he was using the analogy about defacing and tracing and drawing but this is super clear, super clear. All fools have still an itching to deride. And Fabian, yeah. So all fools have still an itching to deride. I like that quote. Basically saying that all fools are going to talk smack anyways because they want to talk smack. It's like, that meme, haters gonna hate. It's kind of the same thing, right? So all fools have still an itching to deride. And I don't know, that's probably a super old meme. I'm probably saying a lot of these things that are aging myself, but yeah, I mean it's that's really like what he's saying. We're not gonna say that in our poem, but just in terms of remembering the meaning of that line and trying to recall that. So if we have a test, we can mention that. Like it might be kind of funny to mention that in a test and under duress of an exam, the teacher might like appreciate that and laugh at that. But in an essay, nah, it's a little bit too informal, a little bit too, you know. So yeah, so awful 7 inching to deride. Those there are who judge still worse than he can write, right? And then later there are who judge still worse than he can write. So there again, this goes back to our thesis, right? He's talking more smack about the critic than the author. He's saying, look, there are way worse critics out there than writers. Or there are. Excuse me. He's not saying that. He's saying that there are critics who are worse critics than their ability to even write themselves. So they're talking smack about the irony of they're talking smack about writing, but they can't even write themselves. So some of these critics, some critics are so bad that they not only are bad critics of material, but they can't even write, well themselves, you know, in their reviews, So again, this supports our thesis, right? So, and then we can talk about this. In search of wit, these lose their common sense and then turn critics in their own defense. Each burns alike who can or cannot write. This is kind of saying the same stuff. We could mention this though, if you wanted to mention this. We could. Each burns alike who can or cannot write. And then we can use a bracket and say like each critic, each of these but it's not really all critics. It's just saying bad critics. And he's saying most, but we already mentioned that. So yeah, I don't think we need to mention those words. or those passages. Okay, so some some have it first for wits and poets past, turn critics next, and improved plain fools at last. Some have it first for wits. So when you think of wits, think of like the author, because um, brevity is the soul of wit, right? It means saying short jokes. Usually gets a lot of laughs. Um, or it shows that you're witty if you can make these short, quippy. And that was probably someone like Alexander Pope. I'm pretty sure. Someone in the comments, if you want to you know, uh, mention that, like who it was. But yeah, I'm sure I could look it up. But yeah, so when in this poem, it looks like wits is more about the author, right? So some people have started out as authors, and then they couldn't pull it off, couldn't do well at it. So then they said, okay, um, and then they turned critics. Oh yeah, so first for wits, then poets past. Um, then poets past. So then maybe they started out as a poet, and then they turned critics. So then they changed to a critic next, and proved plain fools at last. So some critics started out as authors, right? And I know what that means. It just seems very clear. Some started out as authors, and then they proved to everyone that that, that they're terrible at both. They're fools, you know? Like, it's just proof. So again, talking smack about critics. So some have it first for wits and poets past, turned critics next, and proved plain fools at last. So we're just doing the same stuff. Some neither can for wits nor critics pass. Some are, again, he's basically repeating the same stuff. He's saying that um, some are bad at being a writer or a critic. He just said that. So that's what's great about these great poems and these great books, is they go over the same territory. So if you don't quite understand one line or one group of lines, they'll repeat it and they'll give you opportunity to really understand the gist of what the poem is saying, and the different themes and the characters, and etc. So these a lot of these are just mainly ideas. This is sort of like an editorial. This read like an editorial, right? Um, so yeah, so don't worry. If you're like, I don't know poetry, I don't know these lines. These authors really, really, especially the greats. They're so repetitive. Oftentimes, people like Alexander Pope, which makes it a lot easier to write about, even if you don't know every single word and the meaning of every single line or phrase. So it's a big, big plus. So some neither can for wits nor critics pass as heavy meal. So we're not going to mention that because we already mentioned these two lines, which is very similar to those two lines. So again, clarity and be confident in what you're using. If you're not confident in a phrase, like then just you leave it out. So those half-learned witlings, numerous in our isle, to tell them what 100 tongues require. So yeah, let's call them that. He calls these critics half-learned witlings. Again, that defends our thesis. He's talking smack about the critics, saying there's a lot of them. The generation is so equivocal. They wouldn't even understand the word equivocal. They wouldn't even understand. It would take 100 people to explain to them for them to be able to understand, because they're that dumb. They're that foolish and dumb. Or one vain wits that might 100 tire. That might 100 tire. 100 people might get tired telling them, describing what equivocal means, and um, so yeah, I like this. We might only use those 2 lines, but and this is how I do it, guys. This is what I recommend. I mean, just nothing too crazy. You don't need some fancy software. Just writing the notes here and so maybe mention this because I don't. You want to keep it pithy. And there's a lot of stuff here. I mean, how many pages do you think that this will be if we talk about all this stuff? At least 3, 4. I mean, there's a lot here. So you want to be very picky. You want to drop everything in. Everything's got to support your thesis, and then we pick quotes. So let's leave it at that, and we'll go the next stanza. We're only doing parts 1 and 2. So part 1 is a little long. We're not gonna do every single stanza. We're gonna skip 1 or 2 stanzas. So but yeah, we're just knocking this out stanza by stanza. Thank you very much.